I'm really honoured to be here and just listening to all the achievements of the IPA during the year. It's really been a torrid year for free speech, and I think as the IPA wraps up its year, we can praise it for many things, but most particularly, I think, for its timing. Of course, the IPA has had excellent timing for 70 years. And this was the year, of course, of the IPA's Freedom of Speech tour, and never has that topic been hotter. If it's not the expletive-laden private emails of a certain unemployed Scottish Prime Ministerial advisor being leaked to the ABC, it's the traitorous leaks from Edward Snowden to The Guardian, transmitted unquestioningly by our national broadcaster. We've had the ABC declare itself to be the champion of free speech, defending its portrayal of my friend, the Australian columnist Chris Kenny, on his knees with his pants down around his ankles, doing unspeakable things to a dog. And yet, when it comes to publishing stories about a certain slush fund, created by her own admission by the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, for a unionist ex-boyfriend some years ago, the ABC was curiously mute and remains so. Self-censorship rules. And when, of course, a prime ministerial temper tantrum against the hate media ensued, and when journalists lost their jobs, few dared allude to this smelly little story. And the ABC and others in the press gallery even mocked their fallen colleagues. And we can sort of joke about that now because we're now in the safety of a government that understands free speech. But we have just endured a very dark time in Australian history. And what would have seemed impossible a few years ago happened so easily. It seems surreal now, really, looking back from the safety of a new government that does understand freedom. But from the Bolt case in 2010, we moved in 2011, of course, as James just told us, to Nicola Roxon's proposed anti-discrimination laws, so-called. And of course, Stephen Conroy's attempt to muzzle the press last year, egged on by that great freedom lover Bob Brown, and his jihad on the hate media, who he blamed for denying we Earthians somehow not just a carbon tax, but a world government. I was at the IPA's 70th anniversary dinner in this city in April, and I remember walking past through that sort of wall of protesters that my colleague Andrew Bolt also had to walk through, and they were exercising their right of free speech to call Andrew a convicted racist. Now, have you ever heard anything so absurd? Only in Britain, actually, a man was charged there under similar legislation with calling a police horse gay. But these are the absurdities of the law stepping in to protect people, prevent people from taking offence. And these are laws in the guise of protecting the weak, but which simply become tools, weapons for authoritarians to use against their foes. And of course, the left reaches for these weapons instinctively. They use them as weapons and they use them as shields. So it would have seemed unthinkable a few years ago that a democratically elected government in Australia would seek to punish a news organisation for critical coverage just a short time after that previously mentioned prime ministerial temper tantrum. And also that it would succeed in cowing editors at a time when the media is in a very weakened state. But that is exactly what happened. And I said this earlier at another function, an IPA function this year in Canberra, which actually happened to coincide with the very night that Kevin Rudd rolled Julia Gillard. So it was an auspicious night. I said then that it was really the Daily Telegraph, alone among the media, who led the charge against these Conroy provisions, with its very over-the-top sort of Stalinist front pages of Conroy, which so horrified the polite rest of the media. But what that did was it brought that theoretical threat against press freedom into the consciousness of the people of Australia. And of course, the other great champion, almost alone, of the free press was, of course, the IPA, which showed the same relentlessness and fearlessness and uncompromising self-belief in fighting these threats that the Telegraph had. Because in the heat of battle, the threat can be dressed in sheep's clothing, and appeasement seems reasonable. And there was a lot of appeasement going on at the time. You may not even be aware of it, but I was acutely aware of it because I was inside the organisation that was most under threat. And I think in Australia, we like to be moderate. There's nothing that we suspect more than an extremist. But unfortunately, people are called extremists who just have views, have strong views. And in this case, we had the law assisting this culture of intolerance that is built up as a result, in large part, of the political correctness that has crept into our lives in the past 30 years. But what I was taught in American journalism school, and I don't think it's taught in many Australian journalism schools, is that the chilling effect on free speech occurs even if these laws against free speech are never used. This is an argument that's used about 18C, that, well, it's never used, it's just there in reserve, but that's the point. And I think Americans are better at safeguarding press freedom. They inhale the concept with their mother's milk, and it's probably because they have a First Amendment that provides a constitutional place for the free press. And perhaps because of our convict roots, we have more respect for authority and we're less inclined to uphold free speech. Interestingly, having worked both in America and Australia as a journalist, I think that the sort of self-policing that goes on in America is greater, and in my view, that working in both places, that there's a sort of civility to American discourse, despite all their freedoms, that doesn't occur here. I think it was disturbing when earlier this year the Dutch anti-Islam politician Geert Wilders said that Australia, when he visited, Australia was the most repressive of all the Western democracies he has visited. And to me, there was no better proof that free speech in Australia is on the run and not terribly safe than watching what happened to Geert Wilders when he came here. You know, he was treated like a pariah, he was denied a visa for weeks, and he was unable to secure a venue at all for his speaking tour in Perth. In Sydney, I remember interviewing some of the student protesters outside the venue, and their entire argument was that someone who has such repulsive views should not be allowed into Australia. You know, and instead of a welcome to country before he spoke in Sydney and Melbourne, organisers had to read aloud a statement of Victoria's Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. I mean, it was like something out of a bad movie. And in Sydney, he received his loudest applause when he slammed as even more dangerous than the creeping Islamisation that he always warns about and that he's made his living on for several years. Even more dangerous than that, the attempts of governments all over our Western societies to draft bills that restrict our freedom of speech under the pretext of discrimination or hate speech. Now, I don't know, I've been enjoying, you've probably also seen Boris Johnson's recent reflections on Margaret Thatcher's legacy. And Thatcher's system of belief was as much moral as it was economic, and that is what set her apart from contemporary leaders. Of course, it stemmed from her Methodist upbringing that to have freedom, people must also exercise choice. And those choices are, by their nature, discrimination. When people are free to make choices, they must choose between right and wrong. Margaret Thatcher said that we want a society where people are free to make choices, to make mistakes, to be generous and compassionate. And this is what is meant by a moral society, not a society where the state is responsible for everything and no one is responsible for the state. And what she meant by that is that free choice in a free society implies responsibility on the part of the individual. And morality lies in choosing between alternatives. She said a moral being is one who exercises his own judgment in choice on matters of right and wrong. But if this right and duty to choose is taken away by the state, his capacity for choice, that is, his moral faculties, will atrophy. And he becomes a moral cripple in the same way as you would if you'd become a physical cripple if you were prevented from ever using your legs. If you are never exposed to rude or offensive or bad arguments, how will you know good arguments when you see them? How will prejudices and hate be exposed if they are always suppressed? The price of free speech is that offence will be given and untruths will be told, but only then will truth emerge. And of course there is a limit. We talk about, there's defamation and contempt laws and so on, and I think, James was saying, I'm on Twitter quite a bit, firstly as an experiment and now just to see how far it goes. And I think some of the bile on Twitter, could easily do with a bit of defamation law and contempt. And that's a work in progress. But those laws already exist. Which brings me back to the IPA. Unabashed, relentless, vigorous and good-natured. That is the way it fights these battles. And it does it with a good measure of sort of anti-establishment verve while remaining impeccably connected and respected. But there are battles ahead and we need to be forever vigilant. We already have become complacent, even in the short time, less than 100 days, even though Fairfax has been already measuring up Abbott's first 100 days, 20 days before that's happened, and of course given him a Z rating. But we've already become complacent and likely will become more complacent again under this government. I think calls for the ABC, for instance, to be dismantled and the managing director sacked are unwise, because that's just resorting to the same tactics that the left used against Andrew Bolt and Michael Smith and News Corp. I think we've seen, this week we've seen the ABC attempt to try and hose down the criticisms of its great bias. I don't know, we were talking beforehand, if there is any way that you can actually force people at the ABC to think differently. I think it's impossible to even try, but the only thing you can do, I don't understand why so much taxpayers' money is lavished on an organisation, that money that a commercial news organisation wouldn't even dream of having. I think instead of fighting futile battles, we need to explain afresh to every new generation what Thatcher knew in her bones. And that's why an organisation like the IPA is so crucial, and your support for it is so important. Because like Thatcher, the IPA does not need to be told what freedom means. And its timing, like its message, has always been faultless for 70 years. And I think we need it for the next 70 years at least. Thank you.